The Bible is a book like no other. It is one book made up of 66 smaller books that all work together to tell one story, God's story. In this podcast, theologian Kim Burgess helps listeners make sense of that story and to read the Bible the way it was intended. This is Covenant Hermeneutics and Biblical Eschatology.
We are back with Kim Burgess, and we are continuing on with this covenantal hermeneutic process. And we know today that eschatology is always in the news. And for those of you who don't know, there is a new Left Behind film coming out. The first one was with Kirk Cameron, that had three films. And that was in the year 2000. And Nicolas Cage came along and did one in 2014. And there's a new one with Kevin Sorbo, and this one is called The Rise of the Antichrist. And this is getting a lot of publicity. And as a result of that, this is one of the reasons why we're discussing eschatology, because I think that a lot of people are I don't want to say brainwashed, but the only paradigm they seem to have is this end time perspective that we're living in the last days. The rapture's right around the corner, the rise of the Antichrist, rebuilt temple, and so forth and so on. And the question is that the biblical model? Is that what the Bible is really teaching regarding this? And I've written on this for many years, and Kim has as well, but he has not had his work published. And for years we've been talking about getting him to start talking about this. So Kim, we've already done I believe six of these.
Six.
This is our seventh one, and just for the audience's sake, give me some idea of some of the responses you've gotten from people regarding what they've heard so far.
It's been overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah.
Virtually no animosity, no rejection of the thesis at all. In fact, they seem to be quite intrigued by it.
Yeah, and I'm saying the same thing, and I think that's a good sign, because the goal here is to lay out a hermeneutic that people can understand, and it's something that is part and parcel, to the Bible. You should be able to go to the Bible and find this there. Someone points that out and say, "Oh yeah, I see that there. I see that there. I see that there." We need to help them along in order to get them to see some of the things that make understanding eschatology possible. So bring us up to date as to what you want to do today, and because the question always comes up is, okay, all this Old Testament stuff with Israel and the Noahic covenant, Abraham, how does that all fit into all of this?
Well, that's what we're trying to do, but it's very difficult because these are not a series of postgraduate school lectures in a seminary someplace. These are just kind of occasional discussions, and I've somehow got to get content across and discuss it at the same time, which makes it a bit difficult. But I want to put one more hermeneutical illustration on the board to help people understand again one more time, because we're talking about when you approach the scriptures, first of all are a history book, a history of redemption book. We can ask the question later, whose history of redemption and where was it headed? Those are simple questions. Questions that have to be answered. But it's a one in the many process as well. You've got to keep your mind on the whole picture at the same time, and in the light of that whole, you understand the parts. So here's an illustration I would give. And it's 4 blind men, and each one's instructed to reach out and describe what he feels, what he touches, and what he feels. So the first man reaches out and says, "Oh, it's a rubber hose." The next one reaches out and says, "Oh, well, it's a flag, or it's a tent flap." The third one reaches out and says, "Oh, it's a tree trunk." And the third one reaches out and says, "It's a rope." Now, each one of those things, based on the empirical data that they had from their sense of touch, makes plenty of sense. But not one of them had a clue of what they were dealing with, because the reality that all of them failed to capture was they were all talking about an elephant. So what was the hose? Well, that was the elephant's trunk. What was the flag or the ear or the tent flap? Well, that was the elephant's ear. What was the tree trunk? Oh, that was the elephant's leg. what was the rope? That's the elephant's tail. See, without the elephant in your mind the whole time, you could easily misconstrue those component parts, completely not even be on the same page. So that's what I'm trying to do in all this stuff. It seems complicated because it's like putting chess pieces on the board. You've got to be patient to get all those pieces on the board, but you also need to have your mind wrapped around the whole. So the thesis of that illustration is to say that the one determines the proper identity of the many. Without the one, you're not going to properly contextualize and understand the many, or the whole properly identifies the parts. So in this whole rubric, this whole series is about what is that one? And you just mentioned the Old Testament and the complexity of the Old Testament. And when most people want to live in the New Testament and forget the Old, well, you can't understand the New if you don't understand the Old. And my thesis is this, it's simple as this, that one is Old Testament Israel. Why? Because Israel was God's means, God's chosen means to bring salvation to the nations through Israel. So this is where most people get off track. They just think eschatology, because of the creeds and the systematic theologies, that's just about the end of time, the end of world history. No, it's not. It's about Israel, the consummation of Israel's redemptive history that then leads to and has consequences for world history and its own consummation. So Israel's eschatology is the objective, covenantal sense, in the sense of redemption accomplished. It's Israel's eschatology that it's all about. But now we with that on the board, I want to go back and say, but we can't just start with Israel in the middle of nowhere. What was Israel brought into being through Abraham's seed, to do? To deal with the Adamic problem. Now, what was that Adamic problem? Romans 5:12-19, Paul spells it out. Sin, condemnation, and death came into the world because of Adam. And that affected the whole of creation, the whole of what we call world history from that point on. Well, then how come God didn't just, if he's intending to overcome that Adamic problem, here's the next question must be raised. Then why didn't you just go straight to Abraham and cut to the chase and get busy bringing redemption to the world? Now, you tell me, Gary, you know Genesis 1-6. We don't hit Abraham until chapter 12. So what's going on between Genesis 1 and Genesis 3, the fall, and Genesis 6?
Well, yeah, that is I think that is a really good question that a lot of people
Where does it lead?
ask.
Where does it lead?
Yeah.
The flip side to eschatology is protology, the first things. Well, you're not going to understand anything else if you don't understand Genesis.
Exactly.
But here's the question I was raising before. I mean, God deliberately just sat back and just let sin have its way. And so the buildup, the final crescendo, is in chapter 6, verse 5 of Genesis. The wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intent of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. And then God determined he was just going to wipe the slate clean, literally, and start all over, saving the continuity with the old creation through one family, Abraham's family. So, I mean, why did he do that? To show us all what the end result would be if he didn't do anything and just let this sin, condemnation, and death have its way in the world. It would completely trash and destroy everything.
Yeah, let's go. Yeah, if you look at Genesis chapter 8, verse 20, it says Noah built. This is after the flood. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. So the reality of sin is still there.
Exactly.
God,
the flood it may have brought judgment, but it didn't do anything to stop the sin problem. Because what's next down the line from the flood? You get the Tower of Babel.
Right.
But so that's the reason why there's a gap there, to let sin have its way, to show what the end result with all that would be if the Lord had not intervened. But then the key role becomes Noah. I would put the thesis on the table that the Noahic covenant is not a redemptive covenant. I believe that the history of redemption begins with Abraham. New Testament and Epistle makes that, so Hebrews makes that very clear. Noah was the bridge to, because God's not going to start from de novo. He's not going to start from scratch. He still wants to maintain continuity with that old creation, and he does it to Noah and his family. So it's a common grace covenant. He's going to sustain, he's going to preserve creation. So I would quote Genesis 8:22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. And then in chapter 9, verses 9 to 11, God says, Yahweh says this, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is on the with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. So it's like take two here. So Noah and Adam kind of line up because the creation or cultural mandate is reissued with Noah. And so here we go again. But this time, God intends to do something. He intends to bring redemption. He intends to conquer this sin, condemnation, and death that Adam brought into the world. But then why the Tower of Babel? What comes out of that? What good thing comes out of that? The nations, right? That's when you have the language, the separation, because as long as man stays united, he's still in sin, condemnation, and death under the wrath of God. He's going to build his unification against and try to stymie anything God does. So God has to separate and divide, and he uses languages to do that, so that he can then do what? Pick this one man out of Ur of the Chaldees, and out of him literally create a brand new nation that we think of as Israel, or know as Old Testament Israel, for the purpose of bringing redemption to the world. And I think that process is what sets the context for understanding what New Testament eschatology is all about. It's all centered on Israel and Israel's role that Israel was called to play in this process.
I think this is extremely important, because we tend, and I've used this phrase before, that we tend to read the Bible in bits and pieces. We know these little stories all the way through the Bible, but this connectiveness, always asking the question, this was something that Jim Jordan always brings up. He says, why is this story there? Why is this here? And we tend to get bogged down in defending and elements of this that miss the point. You can't see the forest for the trees. So understanding this relationship between Adam and then Noah, the nations, and then all of a sudden, and then Abraham then this one guy shows up here, and God sets him aside, and he's also he's going to be the father of many nations. I mean, this is extremely important for what we find through the rest of the Old Testament and in what Jesus accomplished in the New Testament.
Exactly. Without that background understanding, New Testament's not going to make any sense at all. It's just like it's going to be floating in air without this Old Testament root or foundation behind it, which is why I think time needs to be taken. Though we're hitting it on the fly to deal with all this background. Adam, Noah, leading up to Abraham, and then which is going to morph into Israel. And then here's another question. Where do we start seeing Israel in Scripture in a full-blown sense? Not in Genesis. That's the patriarchs leading to Israel. It's Exodus, right? In exile, in bondage in Egypt. And where do we cease to see Israel in Scripture? That's kind of a trick question, because the answer is, well, we don't. Israel didn't fall. That is, the national form or manifestation of Israel didn't fall until AD 70, and that's, we believe as preterists, that's after the New Testament documents were written, past the pages of the New Testament. So that tells you something. Israel spans the whole gamut from Exodus all the way through Revelation. Now, the church is going to come into that in the New Covenant, when the New Covenant starts to come into being with the person and working of Christ, but it doesn't mean that they supplant Israel. This is not supersessionism. This is not replacement theology. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's usually the typical kind of the typical charge. Oh, you want to replace Israel as God's chosen people, but if you go back and you say, okay, God is dealing with a redemptive entity. He's setting aside an individual and a nation to do a very specific redemptive process.
Right. The nations of the world are kind of like put on hold for the time being. God's going to get there. How do we know that? Because what was the third promise God made to Abraham? And in you and in your seed, all the nations of the earth should be blessed. So God tells us right up front where this whole process is headed, where this whole eschatology is headed, to bring redemption to all the nations, right?
Right.
Through Abraham, through Israel. And so we can't bypass Israel. We can't just jump to world history as if Israel has nothing to do with it, as if all we really need Israel for is to bring Christ in the world and then just focus on Christ and forget everything else. That's not the way the New Testament works. It's not. Otherwise, why would Paul say, I'm telling you, my heart is broken and I would do anything I could? I mean, it's like being Moses pleading for Israel in the Old Testament. So Paul's pleading for Israel. They're my kinsmen, my according to the flesh. I want to do anything I can to save them, because he knew that door was about to close on them. He knew that judgment was coming, and he wanted to save as many of these Israelites as he could. See? He didn't drop the corporate perspective just to go to the individual redemption perspective. He still kept his focus on Israel.
Right. That's why there's so much time devoted, to Israel. You got Matthew chapter 10. Going through all the cities of Israel.
Right. Go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, what's that principle for? Paul told us in Romans 1:16 and 2:10, because this salvation is to the Jew first, then to the Gentile. And that tells you something. Unless this salvation is completed, unless God keeps his promises to Abraham and to Abraham's seed, Israel, then there's no salvation for anybody else. Why would God keep promises of salvation to Gentiles if he didn't even bother to keep promises to his own people, Israel? So that tells you something. Israel is the key. Israel is the key to all this.
How do you answer the objection then to say, the promises made to Israel, that not all the promises made to Israel have been fulfilled? And this is where we are in so much of popular eschatology today.
Well, spell that out. What do you mean what promises haven't been fulfilled?
Well, they'll say, the land promises made to Israel. All the, this special status of Israel under the new covenant, those things haven't been fulfilled yet, and we're still waiting.
Right. I see where you're headed. And we get to the covenant structure model, which is coming up, then we'll deal with that. Because yes, New Testament Israel, New Testament eschatology could be said, and people have rightly said, it's about the restoration of Israel. But it's not the restoration of Israel without a radical transformation of Israel. And that's why we have the distinction, why Hebrews was written, the distinction between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. The Old Covenant form of Israel is one thing. The New Covenant form of Israel is another. And how did we get from the old to the new? Through the death and resurrection of Christ. Christ was born in the last days of the Old Covenant order. And he took that whole Old Covenant order into the grave with him. And he brought out with his resurrection and ascension, and Pentecost, the whole New Covenant order of Israel. And so therefore you can have Paul in Galatians 6:16 praying for the Israel of God. And clearly right there, he's describing what we think of and we know of as the New Covenant church. Now, it's not as if the church replaced Israel. It's that Old Covenant Israel was transformed into the New Covenant Israel through the death and resurrection of Christ. There's continuity and discontinuity at the same time.
The first believers, you read through the book of Acts, the first believers were, in fact, Jews.
All Jews.
Jews living in Israel for every nation under heaven, Acts chapter 2:5. If you go to Acts chapter 5, it talks the first mention of the word ecclesia in the book of Acts.
Yeah.
They were all Jews.
Yep.
So the promises were unfolding to the Jew first. That was the basis of it. That's what Pentecost was all about. That was Peter's sermon, and we embrace that. And I think it's very important that we keep reminding people that God was in fact faithful to his promises made to Israel.
Yes, he was, and he kept them. But the promises change. I don't want to steal the thunder of what's coming down the road, but there were three great promises made to Abraham. One was the people, more multitudes than the sand of the seashore or the stars of the heaven. Another was the land, and the third was the great promise, the blessing of all the nations. And all three of those promises were fulfilled in the Old Testament. I mean, all you have to do is look at the high point. The golden age of Israel's history was under David and especially Solomon. And all three of those promises had come to literal, genetic, racial, geographical, international fulfillment. Think of the Queen of Sheba coming to sit at Solomon's feet to soak up his wisdom. I mean, that's the fulfillment of that promise. But was that all that was intended? Was this some just kind of racial game to exalt the Jews? No, it wasn't. And so as you read on through the Old Testament into the prophets, all three of those fulfillments came crashing down. Israel, the people, winds up in exile. They lost the land, and the nations are mocking God because of how Israel has blasphemed the name of God before the nations. Now, why did that happen? Was God frustrated? No, because he was saying that's not the fulfillment. That's the type, shadow, and symbol of fulfillment. But God then turns around and fulfills those same three promises in the new covenant order. So now we understand who Paul deals with this in Romans 9, who the seed of Abraham are. Galatians 3, who the seed of Abraham. If you're in Christ, you're Abraham's seed, and they're heirs according to the promise. The land promise we understand to be and universalized to include all the nations, as was promised to Abraham.
Yeah, this is First Kings chapter 4, verse 20. It says, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance.
Literal fulfillment.
They were eating and drinking and rejoicing. Now Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms, from the river to the land of the Philistines to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. And those borders are, in fact, the land promise borders that God, in fact, had promised to Israel.
Yep, right. Literally fulfillment. All three of those categories were fulfilled, and it all came crashing down. And then that's where you start getting your clues about not only why we call this hermeneutics. There's a fulfillment according to the flesh, as Paul would put it, and there's a fulfillment which is according to the Spirit. And the flesh is not going to be the way. Literal fulfillment in terms of, I don't know how to describe this, racial, geographical, and Queen of Sheba coming to sit at Solomon's feet. That's not what God's goal was. According to the Spirit means it's still people, but it's not racial. It's still geographical, but it's not limited to one piece of real estate on the face of the earth. And it's blessings going to the nations, not just so the Queen of Sheba can learn some wisdom from Solomon. It's ultimately the salvation, redemption from that Adamic problem of sin, condemnation, and death. It's now being defeated and overcome and accomplished for the sake of the nations, to bring the nations into the kingdom of God. I mean, that in a bird's eye view is what the whole Bible is about.
And we see this in John's Gospel, the first chapter. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become the children of God, even to those who believed in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God.
Right.
And
it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, black or white, male or female, slave or barbarian or whatever. Right. The key is incorporation into Christ, because he is ultimately the seed of Abraham, through which the nations of earth were going to be blessed. But Christ didn't come out of nowhere. Christ is an Israelite. He came out of the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel gave birth to this Christ. And Christ is not going to say, okay, thanks, Israel, for bringing me into being, and therefore you can be trashed, we can move on. No. God's going to keep his promises to Israel, but the question then becomes, how does he keep them? In what form or what manner does he keep them? What's the eternal form of this fulfillment? Not just some temporary fleshly fulfillment. That's why Hebrews is so important. God made that covenant with Israel under that old covenant form, and yet Israel broke it time and time again.
All right, so this might be a good place to stop with this episode, and then we will come back and expand on some of these principles in the next one.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you have questions or comments on what you hear on this podcast, please send them to podcast@americanvision.org, That's podcast@americanvision.org. And until next time, keep reading and studying your Bible.